20 miles west of the Outer Hebrides, out in the northern Atlantic, there is a cluster of jagged rocks called the Flannan Isles. The locals call them the Seven Hunters. They aren't islands for living, they are teeth of basalt rising out of a gray, freezing abyss. For centuries, even the bravest Scottish shepherds refused to spend a single night there. They said the islands belonged to the small folks, spirits that didn't take kindly to human shadows. But in 1899, humanity decided to stake its claim. We built a lighthouse on the largest rock, Eilean Mòr. We lit a flame to defy the darkness. For 1 year, that flame burned bright. But on the night of December 15th, 1900, the captain of a passing steamer, the Arctur, noticed something that made his blood run cold. The horizon was black. The great eye of Eilean Mòr had gone blind. 3 men were stationed there, 3 seasoned, toughened mariners. And when the relief ship finally clawed its way through the winter storms 10 days later, they didn't find bodies. They didn't find a wreck. They found a door left unlocked, a coat hanging on a peg, and a silence so heavy it felt like it was suffocating the island. James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur hadn't just died, they had evaporated into thin air. You're turned in to the Midnight Files. We specialize in the footage the world forgot and the stories they tried to bury. If you're looking for the truth behind the static, you're in the right place. Stick around, things are about to get strange. It's Boxing Day, December 26th. The relief ship, the Hesperus, finally arrives. Usually, when the ship nears, the keepers fly a flag. They ready the shore. They're desperate for mail, for fresh supplies, for a face that isn't one of the other two they've been staring at for weeks. But as the Hesperus sounds its whistle, a blast that should have echoed through every stone of that lighthouse, nothing happens. No flag, no movement, just the screaming of the gulls. The ship's captain, Jim Harvey, fires a flare. Nothing. He sends a small boat to the landing. In it is Joseph Moore, the relief keeper. This was his home, too. These were his brothers. As his boots hit the slippery iron of the east landing, he feels it. The prickle on the back of the neck. The air on Eilean Mòr didn't feel like salt and spray anymore. It suddenly felt like a tomb. Moore climbs the 160 steps to the gallery. He's shouting their names. James, Tom, Donald. Only the wind answers back. He reaches the lighthouse door. It's closed, but unlocked. He steps inside, and the first thing he notices is the kitchen. It's clean. The pots are washed, but the clock on the wall has ticked its last second and stopped dead. He looks at the coat rack. There are 3 pegs. 2 oilskins, the heavy waterproof coats you must wear in a storm, are missing. But the third one, Donald MacArthur's coat, is still hanging there. Now ask yourself, why would a veteran lighthouse keeper walk out into a deadly Atlantic gale in December in his shirt sleeves? Moore runs back to the ship, white as a sheet. He tells Captain Harvey, the men are gone. A search party returns to the island. They go to the West Landing, the side of the island that takes the brunt of the ocean's fury. What they see there defies all logic. The storage vault, perched 75 feet above the sea, had been broken into, not by men, but by the water. An iron railing, thick as a man's wrist, was twisted into a corkscrew. A concrete block weighing more than a ton had been ripped from the ground and tossed aside like a pebble. But here's the kicker: the lighthouse itself, pristine. The lamps are cleaned, the wicks are trimmed, the oil tanks are full. Whoever had been there last had done their duty to the letter before they stepped off the face of the earth. The searchers spent hours scouring every inch of that rock. They looked in the gear sheds, they looked in the jagged geos, or narrow inlets where a body might wash up. Nothing. No caps, no boots, no blood. Just 3 men, gone without a trace, leaving behind a half written logbook that would soon become the most terrifying piece of evidence in maritime history. They found the logbook on the desk. The entries leading up to the disappearance are weird. December 12th. Thomas Marshall writes that a gale is blowing, the likes of which he has never seen in 20 years. He writes that James Ducat, the head keeper, a man known for being as tough as the rock he stood on, was very quiet. And Donald MacArthur, the third man, was crying. Think about that. A grizzled veteran sailor crying because of a storm inside a lighthouse built to withstand anything? December 13th, Marshall writes that they are all praying. December 15th, the final entry. It simply reads, Storm ended, sea is calm, God is over all. But here's the problem. On the mainland, on those exact dates, the 12th, 13th, and 14th, the weather reports were clear. There was no storm, and the seas were calm. Was the storm only happening to Eilean Mòr, or was the storm inside the lighthouse? By December 29th, the superintendent of the Northern Lighthouse Board, Robert Muirhead, arrived on the island. He wasn't a man given to ghost stories. He was a man of bolts, glass, and oil. He knew these men personally. He had hired them. Muirhead walked the same steps Joseph Moore had taken, but he was looking for something else. The why. He found the kitchen exactly as Moore described. The pots were cleaned and put away, the lamps were trimmed and ready for the next night. This tells us one vital thing. The disappearance didn't happen during a moment of sudden internal chaos. There wasn't a struggle in that room. Whatever took them, it happened while they were on duty, or at least while they were following the rigid clockwork rhythm of lighthouse life. But then, Muirhead went outside to the West Landing, and the rational explanation would soon start to crumble. To understand the West Landing, you'd have to understand the height. We aren't talking about a beach, we're talking about cliffs that soar 200 feet above the Atlantic Ocean. Muirhead found a supply crane, a massive iron structure used to haul crates up from the ships, twisted like a piece of wet spaghetti. A life buoy bolted into the rock 110 feet above the sea had been ripped clean off its mountings. Even more terrifying, a massive rock weighing over a ton had been shoved from its resting place and moved several feet along the cliff edge. For the sea to do that, a wave would have to be nearly 200 feet high. That isn't a wave, that's a wall of moving skyscraper. But remember the logbook? Storm ended, sea calm. If the sea was calm on the 15th, when did this destruction happen? And if it happened during the storm on the 12th, why were the men still writing in the logbook until the 15th? The most logical theory, the one Muirhead eventually put in his official report, is the rogue wave. Imagine Ducat and Marshall are down at the West Landing. They're trying to secure a box of ropes or gear that's been battered by the surf. MacArthur, the third man, is up in the lighthouse. Remember, his coat was still on the peg. Suddenly, he sees it, a Three Sisters wave. Three massive swells that combine into one freakish mountain of water. It's heading straight for his friends. MacArthur, in a moment of pure panicked instinct, runs out the door. He doesn't grab his coat, he doesn't lock the door, he just runs down the 160 steps to warn them. He reaches the landing just as the wave hits. It sweeps all three of them into the churning geos, the narrow rocky inlets. In that water, with those temperatures, you don't swim, you just break. It's a neat theory. It explains the missing coast and the damage, but it doesn't explain the logbook, and it doesn't explain why three veteran keepers, men who knew the sea better than they knew their own wives, would be standing on a lower landing during a storm of that magnitude. But there is a darker theory, one that doesn't involve the ocean at all. Lighthouse keeping in 1900 was a recipe for madness. Three men locked on a rock for weeks at a time in a space no bigger than a small apartment. No radio, no escape. Donald MacArthur was known to be a tempestuous man, a brawler. Did something snap? Maybe a disagreement over a card game or a comment about a family member turned into a fever pitch. In this version of the story, one man kills the other two, perhaps pushing them from the cliffs in a fit of rage. Then, realizing what he's done, realizing he can never leave this rock without facing the gallows, he stares into the light one last time and steps into the abyss himself. It would explain why the lighthouse was so clean. The survivor spent his final hours cleaning, obsessively, trying to find some order in the madness before he ended it. But there's a third possibility, one that the locals and the Hebrides still whisper about, one that suggests the men didn't die, they were taken. Before the lighthouse was even a blueprint, the Flannan Isles were considered otherworldly. For centuries, shepherds from the Isle of Lewis would ferry their sheep there to graze, but they had very strict rules. They would never stay the night. They called the islands the sanctuary of Saint Flannan, but they feared the original inhabitants. The phantom birds, or the small folks, these weren't fairies from a children's book, these were ancient territorial spirits. The shepherds had a ritual. When they stepped onto the Eilean Mòr, they had to take off their hats, turn sunwise, and pray. If you didn't show the rock respect, the rock took something from you. When the Northern Lighthouse Board built that stone tower, they didn't pray. They blasted the rock with dynamite. They hammered iron into its bones. The locals whispered that the islands were waiting for a chance to reclaim their silence. Did the three keepers simply offend the mountain? There is a terrifying account from a passing ship just days before the Hesperus arrived. The crew claimed they saw something through the sea mist. Not a wave, but a shape. They described it giant black birds, larger than any albatross, circling the gallery of the lighthouse. Now, scientifically, we know Eilean Mòr is a nesting ground for puffins and gannets, but the legend persists. These weren't birds, but shapeshifters. In Gaelic lore, there are stories of the Long Men, giant spirits who guard the seven hunters. Some believe the three keepers didn't fall, they were plucked, lifted right off the gallery by something that didn't belong in our sky. It sounds crazy until you remember that 110-foot life buoy ripped from the cliff. A wave can wash it away, but could something pull it? Let's go back to the ship that first noticed the light was out, the Arctur. When the Arctur docked in Leith, the captain reported the darkened lighthouse. But here's where the story gets strange. Shortly after reporting the missing light, the Arctur itself ran aground and sank. In maritime circles, they say the Flannan mystery is a contagion. It's as if the darkness that took the keepers followed the ship that saw them. Some theories suggest the keepers saw a ghost ship, a vessel that shouldn't have been there, and in their attempt to signal it or help it, they were lured down to the water's edge. In the mist of the North Atlantic, your eyes can play tricks on you. You see a hole where there is only fog. You hear a whistle where there is only wind. Did the three men walk into the ocean thinking they were walking onto a deck that wasn't there? Let's look closer at that logbook. I told you before that the weather reports didn't match the entries, but what if the men weren't lying? What if they were experiencing a different reality altogether? Some theories suggest Eilean Mòr sits on a thin place, a geographical rift where time doesn't move in a straight line. If James Ducat was writing about a world ending storm while the mainland saw clear skies, perhaps he wasn't in our December 1900 anymore. Did the three keepers slip into a pocket of time where the storm was real and the lighthouse was the only thing keeping them grounded? If they stepped out the door to check the lamps, they might have stepped out of 1900 entirely. It would explain why no bodies were ever found. They weren't at the bottom of the ocean, they were simply somewhere else. In the 1900s, they called them phantom birds or longmen. Today, we have a different word, UAPs. The Flannan Isles sit in a highly magnetic, isolated corridor of the North Atlantic. Throughout the 20th century, pilots and sailors in the Hebrides reported foo fighters, balls of light that dance over the waves. Consider the evidence. Two sets of oilskins gone, one left behind. No sign of a struggle. Equipment moved with surgical precision. If an intelligence was observing the light, they might have seen the keepers as specimens. Some believe the giant birds, described by passing ships, weren't biological creatures, but aircraft. Did the men walk out onto the gallery to investigate a light that wasn't their own, only to be harvested by something from above? When the Hesperus arrived, the island wasn't just empty, it felt completely vacated. We like to think we've mapped the ocean, but in 1900 the deep was still a monster's playground. The damage at the West Landing, the twisted iron, the moved boulders, it looks like wave damage, but some cryptozoologists point to the specific way the iron was bent. It wasn't crushed, it was pulled. There were old Gaelic tales of the Syrian Croing, a sea monster so large it fed on 7 whales. If a creature of that magnitude breached near the cliffs, the displacement of water alone would mimic a rogue wave. But the crying and praying in the logbook? Maybe they weren't praying to survive a storm. Maybe they were looking down into the water and seeing a giant eye staring back at them. There is a phenomenon called the third man factor, a shared hallucination often experienced by people in extreme isolation. But what if it wasn't just a feeling? What if the rock itself, the salt, the infrasound caused by the wind whistling through the geos, created a frequency that shattered their minds? Infrasound can cause feelings of dread, nausea, and even visual hallucinations of gray figures. If all three men began seeing the same ghosts or hearing the same screams from the cliffs, mass hysteria could have set in. One man runs for the door to save a phantom, the other two chase him to bring him back. In the darkness and the wind, they follow each other right over the edge, believing they are stepping onto solid ground. While we speculate about sea monsters and time slips, there was a very real, very human tragedy unfolding on the mainland. Three families were waiting for men who would never come home. The Northern Lighthouse Board had to send the official word. Imagine being the wife of James Ducat, opening a letter that doesn't offer a body to bury, but simply states your husband has vanished into thin air. The board's final report to the families was cold. It was essentially blaming the men for their own deaths, suggesting they were careless enough to be near the water during a storm. But for those who knew them, for the wives who had seen these men survive decades of Atlantic winters, that explanation felt like a second drowning. They knew their husbands didn't fear the sea, they respected it. And a man who respects the sea doesn't stand on a landing in a gale without a coat. Then there is Joseph Moore, the man who found the empty kitchen, the man who had to live with the silence. Moore was supposed to be on that rock. If the weather hadn't delayed the Hesperus, he would have been the fourth man. For the rest of his life, he was a broken man. He was haunted by the what ifs. He eventually returned to the lighthouse service, but colleagues said he was never all there. He would stare out at the horizon as if he was waiting for Ducat, Marshall, and MacArthur to walk back out of those waves. He told friends that he felt he had left his soul on Eilean Mòr. Joseph Moore, the man who first walked into that empty kitchen, lived for another 33 years, but he never truly left Eilean Mòr. He moved from lighthouse to lighthouse, but his logbooks became increasingly sparse. He became a man of few words, as if he was afraid that if he spoke too much, the silence of the Flannans would hear him. He once told a friend that the worst part wasn't the mystery, it was the perfection of the scene that he had found. The way the oiled wicks were trimmed, the way the chair was pushed back just so. It looked as if these men had been called by a voice they couldn't ignore, leaving their lives mid sentence. Before he died, Moore allegedly whispered that he did find something else in that lighthouse. Something he never told the official inquiry. Something so unsettling he took it to his grave. Was it a note, a charm, or a footprint that didn't belong to a man? When Moore died in 1933, he was still asking the same question we are asking tonight. How can three men leave a room and never arrive anywhere else? The Flannan Isles lighthouse was automated in 1971. No one lives there now. The seven hunters have returned to the birds and the spirits. But the mystery didn't end in 1900. To this day, maintenance crews who visit the islands report a heavy feeling. They talk about equipment disappearing and reappearing in odd places. They talk about the unseen residents who still walk that 160 steps. We want an answer. We want to find a bone, a boot, a confession. But the North Atlantic doesn't give up as dead, and Eilean Mòr doesn't share its secrets. The three men of the Flannan Isles are part of that rock now. Today, Eilean Mòr is silent. There are no more logbooks to write, no more coasts to hang on the pegs. But pilots flying the North Atlantic route still look down at that tiny white tower. They see the foam breaking against the west landing, and they remember the three men who defied the sea until the sea decided it had had enough. The mystery remains, the ocean remains, and somewhere out past the edge of the world, three men are still waiting for a relief ship that arrived a little too late. Thanks for sitting by the fire with me tonight. The next time the wind picks up, remember, some secrets are better left at the bottom of the Atlantic. That's all for tonight's entry. If these files kept you up, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join the archive so you never miss a discovery. Leave a comment with all your theories. I'll be reading them. Until next time, stay curious. Bye.